We've been blessed throughout the televised iteration of the mother of all talk shows with the eloquence of a young Texan woman. A young Texan woman of great perspicacity and eloquence. Her name is Rachel Blevins. You'll know what I'm talking about once you've seen her. Rachel, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. I don't know whether to laugh or cry when I see your president and your vice president in public, which oddly they continue to do. If I was running Joe Biden's election campaign, I would not be putting him on platform after platform from which he either falls off, gets lost upon, can't find the exit from, has to be led from by other people as an increasingly geriatric patient. He's like a man in a sanatorium. I'm waiting for him turning up with his dressing gown and pajamas on. And then I see Kamala Harris, and she's even worse. What on earth is happening in the United States?
That is an excellent question. And sometimes I look at it and go, oh, this is the president of the United States. This is the one who we are told is in charge. And, it's funny because just a couple of weeks ago when we were looking at the headlines being driven by the trial that former President Trump was a part of, a lot of people were going, where is Biden? Why isn't he campaigning more? And then over the last 2 weeks, we've seen the really exact answer to that question, which, as we've seen, every time Joe Biden is in public, he's having to be let off stage. He's freezing up. It's just embarrassing. And as you pointed out there, Kamala Harris is not much better. She was in Switzerland for this, well, we're calling it the Not Peace Summit that Zelensky is hosting there, because it obviously is not about peace in Ukraine. But she shows up there for a few hours, says a few words to Zelensky, and then she has the audacity to claim that the U.S. wants to see a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. After everything that the U.S. has done to Ukraine over the last 10, 11 years alone, and yet Kamala Harris is there claiming that we are the ones who want peace. The U.S. does not want to see just and lasting peace anywhere in this world, and I guess she didn't give us much more content, right, to talk about or to react to, because just as quickly as she showed up, she then also very quickly left and made it back to the United States, leaving National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan there to carry on with the summit. It tells you exactly what this summit is really about, but it also tells you about the state of the Biden administration, that Joe Biden himself is too busy at a, fancy Hollywood star-studded fundraiser here in the U.S., warning about the dangers of Donald Trump. Kamala Harris is too busy showing up there for a minute, and it's like, this is the administration that the United States is presenting to the rest of the world at this point.
I'm going to come back to Sullivan and Blinken and so on, because, of course, if Biden is not running America, then somebody else is. I'd like to drill down on that question. But the farce in Switzerland, I'm calling it the Swiss roll, the only person who got anything out of it was Zelensky. All the other leaders looked like they wished they were somewhere else. But we ended with the farce of the Italian Prime Minister, the famously warlike Italians, threatening Russia that they will force them to surrender. It makes you wonder if these people really believe what they're saying, or they're saying it for another purpose. Because, of course, neither all of NATO, and definitely not Italy, are in any position to impose anything on Russia at all.
Oh, absolutely. And wasn't Giorgia Meloni supposed to be presenting some kind of different platform? At least that's what I was told when she was running. But does not seem that way, especially when it comes to her policies, not just on Ukraine, but also on Palestine and her support for Israel. But yeah, I mean, you look at where NATO is right now, and I think you laid it out perfectly in your intro when you were talking about the G7 leaders. And it, at this point, is the loser's circle. You have all of these people like Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron that just lost royally with the EU parliamentary elections. You have them get together with what? Rishi Sunak, Joe Biden. I guess Georgia Maloney is the only one who would consider herself a winner there. But for them to act like, at this point in 2024, that they have any chance of forcing Russia's hand, of forcing Russian troops anywhere at this point is just laughable. I mean, I guess they could say those things back in early 2022 when they acted as if the sanctions campaign that they were enacting against Russia was going to lead to some meaningful change, which it clearly has not. But at this point, when you have Russian President Putin just a few days ago coming out and saying, look, if you want to have actual peace talks, not whatever you're claiming is happening in Switzerland, here are our demands. It's very clear cut. It's saying, hey, we are open to talks, but this is what is required. And then you see the response from NATO, and it just makes me think they do not live in reality at this point, right? There's no way they can look at the battlefield in Ukraine and think to themselves, okay, we're just going to turn to some harsh words, or as the Biden administration attempted to do this week, we're just going to enact some more sanctions, as if they have anything else in Russia that they can sanction at this point. Now they've turned to trying to sanction third parties or other countries for working with Russia. And it's like, if you look at China, continuing to work with Russia was the smartest thing they could have done over the last couple of years. And that is exactly what they have done. And so I think when you look at the summit and you see, well, China's not there. You've even got Saudi Arabia's foreign minister who was dragged there. Now he's admitting without Russia here, there is no chance at peace. It's the most obvious logical statement, but yet it's the one that these NATO members and these G7 members specifically act as if they just can't see, and then they continue on in this direction while keeping Kiev on life support and acting like another $50 or $60 billion is going to have a meaningful effect at this point.
Let's drill down, as I said I wanted to, on who is running the United States. If not Biden, who? Now, looking at that rock and roll show, although it was pretty ersatz rock and roll, the bits that I saw, doesn't really qualify as rock and roll. The man in charge looked to be Barack Obama. And I have the unpopular view that we are actually in the third Obama term, that he is the man actually governing America. But others think it's Blinken and Sullivan and people whose names are not that well known, at least on this side of the ocean. What's your take on that?
You know, I think at this point it almost seems like it's all of the above, because you have to ask yourself what differentiates Obama from Blinken, from, you know, anyone behind the curtain in some sort of a deep state scenario. They all seem to want the same thing. And so as we've seen with someone like Barack Obama, I mean, he came in as Mr. Hope and Change. He came in as, I'm going to, you know, come in and end the wars. And then he turned around and he did the opposite. You've got someone like Donald Trump, who I know he's still a little bit more anti-establishment in some ways, but I still look at him and his foreign policy and remember that he is the one who has been just brazenly pro-Israel to the detriment of the Palestinians. He's the one who dropped the mother of all bombs on Afghanistan. And he's also the one who has carried on with this rhetoric while acting like, okay, maybe I'll come in and I'll change things, I'll end the conflict in Ukraine in 24 hours. But it's hard to believe it when you look at his time in office. Then you look at Joe Biden, and he's not even trying, right? He's not even trying to act as if he would do anything differently than what kind of the U.S. establishment, the military industrial complex as a whole, what their foreign policy has become, which is putting the United States in a position where we're rushing towards World War III. It's just kind of pick a lane. Do you want it to be against Russia, against China, against Iran? And it is incredibly disturbing to see, even in this election, right? We look at the third person on the ticket. Oh, it's Robert F. Kennedy Jr. While he is getting some traction in polls, he also has been an out and out self-proclaimed Zionist, speaking very proudly about his support for Israel. And so I think when you look at the American people, you look at all of the students who have protested, the people who are waking up to the reality of U.S. foreign policy and saying, well, wait a second, I don't want my tax dollars to be spent funding a genocide on the other side of the world. They see the images and the videos of the Palestinian children being killed by Israel using American-made bombs. And then you look at the landscape for our upcoming election, the fact that we're supposed to have a presidential debate in just a couple of weeks, and you're like, oh, it's Trump versus Biden with RFK Jr. attempting to get on the stage. It does not spell anything good for the future of the United States at this point.
Indeed, the Kennedy's Middle East policy is a chamber of horrors, unspeakable horrors. He says things that even Netanyahu would be embarrassed to say, called the Palestinians the most coddled people in the world, for example, whilst a genocide was taking place. To me, that's only explicable by compromat, because Kennedy's other policies are radical and challenging. So today, for example, he says he will cut American military budgets by 50%. He'll cut them in half. Now, how that's possible to be as radical as that on such an issue as that, and simultaneously be more Likud than the Likud, more Netanyahu than Netanyahu, is very difficult to understand. But you say he's getting some traction in the polls. Tell us about that, will you? Because we don't see as many polls from the US as you do.
Yeah, I know a lot of the polls that come out pretty much have Trump and Biden neck and neck, right? They're going to be very close when it comes to their numbers. When they do factor in other third-party candidates like RFK Jr., like Jill Stein and Cornel West, typically Kennedy performs the best out of them. I know he's gotten around 10%, maybe even 12% in some recent polls. So there is some traction right now, unfortunately, and I do say unfortunately, because of some of his other policies. I think it would be good if he was actually on the debate stage challenging Trump and Biden. And unfortunately, because Biden has come in and completely rewritten the rules for the presidential debates, required them to only be held by CNN and ABC News, and for the threshold to be increased. Because of that, we are not likely to see an RFK Jr. on the debate stage. And it is much more likely to be, if this debate does happen at all, it's likely to be just Trump and Biden. And we are likely to sit there wondering how in the world we got into this scenario once again, because as we saw it, and I think that Biden coming out and claiming that, oh, we have a ceasefire deal, right? Just a couple of weeks ago, he acts as though this new three-phase plan is Israel's idea. Well, you look at Israel, they don't seem to have even heard of it, let alone come up with the plan or endorsed it. But the one line they follow is that Hamas has to accept this. It's all on Hamas. Don't worry about Israel. Well, Hamas comes out and says, hey, let's move forward with it, but we need to make some changes which are in line with everything that they've been saying this entire time. And then you look back to the Biden administration, and Blinken and Biden and all of them act as if, oh, well, Hamas rejected it. That's completely on them. And I think that that is almost the perfect picture of what we have seen from the Biden administration lately. They're never fully honest and accurate, and they are well aware of just how much you have voters in this country that typically would be Democratic-leaning voters that now will not vote for Biden because of his policy on Gaza. They're not going to vote for Trump or RFK. They are much more likely to just stay home in 2024 because they don't see a candidate really bringing any meaningful change on an issue that is incredibly important to them.
Dr. Jill Stein obviously harms the so-called Democrats. Whose vote is RFK's? Is he taking votes from Joe Biden, or is he taking them from Donald Trump too?
That has been the biggest question, I think. I would argue he's taking them from both. Now, some may see it as a little bit more from Biden because obviously you have all of these. Well, and maybe that would have been said before we saw an all-out genocide happening in Gaza that was funded by the US, right? Maybe if we go to pre-October, then the argument would have been, okay, he's taking votes from Biden in some places now that their policies are almost indistinguishable. In a way, he's also taking a number of votes from Trump because you have RFK as someone who is calling out Ukraine, right? He's calling out a number of places where the US establishment typically comes in and plays a role as Biden supports it. And so I do think that he's kind of pulling from them both. The biggest question is going to be how many people who typically would vote for Trump are not going to vote for him now, especially after seeing Trump on trial, after seeing this just ridiculous verdict that we saw in New York, where you had a case for falsifying business records that was turned into the Stormy Daniels hush money trial and blown up by the media and by the Democrats. A lot of Republicans and would-be Republicans who were considering voting for Trump, maybe they were kind of thinking, I won't go do it this year. But if they look at that trial, I would argue that they would be even more likely to go and to vote for him because they see the alternative as being a Joe Biden who is using all of these lawfare cases to go after his main political opponent. So I'm curious to see how many people actually vote for Kennedy versus how many say in these recent polls, oh yeah, sure, I'd vote for him, versus going out and actually doing it or deciding not to vote at all.
Very interesting. As always, Rachel Blevins, journalist, political commentator, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.